of Jesus. They're graphic, they're unsettling, they make us nervous. And there's people throughout history who have taken this, especially cutting off and plucking out, literally. There's people who have either to someone else that they deem to have broken some rule, cut off limbs, plucked out eyes. People have done it to themselves because they take it literally. Now there's people who have taken it figuratively to the point that it's only about them. I'm going to eliminate anything in my life that causes me to stumble, which also makes it all about ourselves. It doesn't help us in life. David Henson grew up this way. He writes it like this. Like many who grew up in the evangelical Protestant church, I lived out my life as a young man with a Bible in one hand and an axe in the other. My tradition taught me that faith was primarily about avoiding temptation, resisting sin and secularity, and escaping divine punishment and wrath. In short, I learned to reduce my relationship with God to a transaction that provided me with divine fire insurance. For me as a teenager, this played out in a few very vivid ways. For instance, when I was 17, I decided to give away my entire rock music collection so I would no longer be tempted by its swear words or sexual innuendo, and so I could listen exclusively to Christian music. Well, this was a rite of passage of many evangelicals in my era. My friends thought I lost my mind. But they didn't protest too much when I was handing out Metallica CDs like Halloween candy. Less comically, though, was the time I broke up with my first serious girlfriend because she didn't feel comfortable praying with me or adding a spiritual component to our high school relationship. As I came to find out later, she was the wiser of the two of us. But it took several years to realize that. By that time, I'd already hacked and cut away at my life, my friendships, and even my choices of colleges, all in the name of God and avoiding temptation. What I didn't realize at the time, however, was that I was whittling down my potential temptations, I was also whittling down, narrowing, and shrinking my understanding of God. God hadn't just become small, but small-minded, whose primary power lay in the threat of punishment rather than the empowering movement of love and grace. Faith and spirituality became about the rules, about right and wrong, about who was in and who was out, who was going to be rewarded by God, and who was going to be punished. Notice this little monologue of Jesus begins right after the disciples had come and said, someone's doing something that was not a follower of ours. The beginning of us and them for the Christian church. The beginning of we're right, they're wrong. And so Jesus answers in this very graphic, dramatic way that still is unsettling. But what if the obstacles he's talking about knocking down, getting out of the way, hacking off, cutting off, are the things that keep us from each other, that keep us from seeing God in God's wholeness and wideness? Instead of it being this narcissistic approach of, look what I've done, I've eliminated all these terrible things in my life. It's hard work to cut out those things, those stereotypes we have of people, the wanting to judge someone else. The desire to have the us and them, those are the obstacles that cause problems in the Christian church. It causes a problem in me seeing God, for God being whole and not making God in my own image, and our relationship with each other. So it's graphic, it's dramatic, and I might have taken a different approach, but it helps us to see an answer to this question. Because Jesus is talking to the disciples here. It's not a big crowd gathering. He's saying this is how we live as the people of God. To follow me is going to be painful because you're going to have to let go of things that you thought were so sacred, and most of those were destructive for community and for relationships. A marriage therapist offered advice to a couple that I think could be used in congregations. I think Jesus or Paul could have written these words. What would it look like for each of you to help the other person succeed? Instead of calling out each other's faults, instead of focusing only on your own comfort and rightness, instead of making an already hard road even harder for your partner to travel, what if you each committed to helping the other? What if you cleared paths for each other, removed obstacles for each other, helped each other towards wholeness? Jesus says this is how we live. This is how we live in community. Is it hard? Of course it is. It feels like hacking off and plucking out and throwing millstones into the water. But it also breaks down those barriers, those boundaries, those ways that we separate each other from God's blessing and grace. And then Jesus turns to this salty language. Many of the words we hear in this gospel are taken from other gospels as well. It's interesting that from cutting off and plucking out and throwing, we go to this salt language. We know that salt is an essential mineral in our lives. We know that salt has many purposes that we don't even think about. And like we talked about in the children's sermon, most of the time it's such a small amount. Sometimes I think we think, maybe like David Henson, that we have to have this big life to show that we trust God. Jesus reminds us it's subtle. It's like that little bit, that teaspoon of sugar or salt, or that pinch of salt that goes into something that makes all the difference. Think about those moments that you felt the most impacted by the grace of God. It might have been a huge Easter service or a Christmas Eve service, but it was maybe somebody in a hospital room. Maybe it was someone in the grocery store. Maybe it was being invited to someone's table and there was a holy conversation. It's usually in those small ways that do not seem very glorious, but it is essential for us to believe the tangible love of God in those moments. Like salt, though, too much is bad, and we all know those people in our life who went too far, Bible baiting, if you will. That when we make it above the agenda, instead of living ordinary, that pinch of salt that goes into the cookie dough, that little bit of salt that's needed to make the bread rise, those are the people that we find to be authentic and find to be those who experience God most fully. Jesus said, have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another. He's very clear as he speaks to this group of followers. It's about boundaries and character. That God is so much a part of us that we live into it. That I go out in the world, I've been forgiven, so I go out and forgive. I have been given grace upon grace, so I live it in my lives, in our lives. Like the choir anthem, those evidence of grace we find is that subtleness, that ability to be a part of each other's lives day in and day out, to walk hard roads together, and to celebrate incredible moments together. We become salty prophets, I believe, in the world. At the end of Numbers, where Moses said, if all the people were prophets and if God's Spirit were on all of them, we're people of Jesus. We've been given that promise through our baptism that Spirit is upon us. Someone last night said they want to be a salty dog. This year I'm going with salty prophets. Maybe in 3 years we'll go with salty dog. But what does that mean to be a prophet? Each of you is called by your baptism to be a prophet. Prophets are not fortune tellers. They do not tell the future. What they do is speak truth to power. What they do is speak the truth in settings where sometimes we don't want to hear it. What they do is speak grace in moments where we just carry shame in our lives and cannot get beyond it. Walter Brueggemann says about the biblical prophet as the one who contends against the normal order of society and culture, which has set itself up at the expense of the marginalized, the outcast, the poor, and the weak. Brueggemann calls this a royal consciousness and argues that the prophet does not contend against such entities with arms and use of force, but with the much more powerful weapons of imagination and creativity. We are called. We are sent out. And as much as I like cayenne pepper and Tabasco sauce, I'm sent out as people who are called to have salt, to be those agents in small ways that make such a difference, to see God's face in those small ways. As someone says, good morning, or what can I do to help? Or I don't have words for the sadness you're feeling, but I think about you day and night. That's salt. That's life. That's our call. I'd like to close with words by Jan Richardson, blessing of salt and fire. And so in this season, may we give ourselves to the fire that shows us what is elemental and sacramental, that reveals what remains after all that does not have substance or savor falls away. May we turn our eyes, our ears, our hands to the beauty for which we were formed, and bear with grace the patterns that blossom upon us, who live salted and seen.